The second argument that we can make here is to kind of, even if we wanted to accept the argument from safety um, in terms of what it wants to say, all that it we can try and give an objection which will limit the kind of impact of the argument in terms of what the conclusion justifies and how broad it applies. So it seems like concerns about injury really only apply to certain contact sports. So we might think that even if we accept the argument from safety, all this shows is that maybe there should be an increased case for segregated competition in things like football or rugby. But when it comes to the majority of sports, which are going to be non-contact or indeed indirect in terms of how they compete, um, then the argument from safety is not going to be something that's relevant to those sports. And then finally, to take the argument more directly, we might think of whether the conclusion follows from the premises, which is that the conclusion is going to be that girls have a right to exclude boys and have their own competitions. But we might think that another option here that could alleviate this problem, this concern about injuries, is to think about changing the way that the game is played. So why should the onus be on girls to segregate and form their own league versus another option being that we should have harsh penalties in place for injuries, or we should have slight rule changes which decrease the likelihood of injuries, or have behavioral changes that are put in place to minimize the risk of injuries. So there's a question here about why should the onus be placed on girls to segregate if they are put at risk by boys? Why should the onus not be on either changing the actions versus or changing the rule set to make it so that injuries are less common? However, a concern has been raised here that by many boys who have been competing against girls in kinds of integrated competition, that they don't want to play as hard if they're competing against girls. And there's a lot of norms that are in place here. So there's a case that I was reading about in one of the papers that I was looking at while preparing these lectures that of integrated kind of wrestling competition, where a boy who was predicted to do very well in the competition refused to compete because he didn't want to compete against a girl for fear of hurting her and going against his kind of values about what was justified in terms of integrated competition. And so he ended up pulling out of the competition. There's a question here about, how this phenomenon should be taken into account when we're thinking about the options that we have for integrating sports.